Welcome to Catalistas Here to There, coming to you from the gardens at Catalista Centrale. My name is Mina Joshua. What blocks humanity from solving our fundamental predicaments? On Here to There, we invite guests to share current approaches, impediments to resolution, and ask how to speed the ride from here to there. Our first topic is biodiversity, which comes to you in two parts. Here and there. Here is guided by three questions. What should we feel most concerned about when it comes to biodiversity? How are people and organizations dealing with the continuing collapse of biodiversity? And what gets in the way of proposed solutions? Dr. William Rees is a population ecologist and ecological economist. He is Professor Emeritus and the former director of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning in Vancouver, Canada. Bill has authored and co-authored more than 150 peer-reviewed papers and many widely read articles on humanity's connection to sustainability and non-sustainability. Bill, welcome to Centrale's Gardens. Let's start the conversation with you. What issues related to biodiversity should be common knowledge?
Well, first of all, biodiversity is declining very rapidly. In the past, 3 or 4 years, we've seen papers published to show that human beings who started at about 1% or less of mammalian biomass, say 10,000 years ago, at the dawn of agriculture, have gradually increased, especially in the last 200 years. So it took us about 250,000 years, actually, to reach our first billion in 1810 or thereabout. And then in just 1/1250th as much time, the human beings have increased on the planet to 7 billion and now 8 billion. So there's an eightfold increase in one tiny fraction of 1% of human history. And the impact has been astonishing. So that fewer than 1% of the biomass of mammals, humans are now 36% of the biomass of mammals on Earth. But if you throw in our domestic livestock, they're another 62 or 3%. So wild mammals have now been reduced to about 3 or 4% at most of the total biomass of mammals on the planet. So we see these massive herds of animals in Africa and so on. It's a fraction of what used to exist. And people say, well, that can't be. Well, I said, well, of course it can be, because if you went back to the middle part of the 19th century in North America, there were 40 to 60 million bison up and down the Great Plains of North America. Well, now there's a few thousand left in zoos and ranches. So there's been an enormous displacement of wildlife by the growth of the human enterprise. So you see, every organism on Earth, let's just talk about consumer organisms like humans and mammals. We all depend on photosynthesis by green plants. And as the human enterprise has expanded, it simply means that the more humans get, the less is available for everything else. So what we've done is literally displaced all of these bison, not to mention the pronghorns and bears and wolves and so on from the Great Plains, and all of the bioenergy flowing through that system that used to support those many millions of bison and other animals now support hundreds of millions of human beings. And it's that way all over the world. So humans have taken over something like 70% of the global landmass, or at least altered it, the green part of the planet, and diverted the products of photosynthesis to our own use, or the use of our domestic mammals. And that means that there's less and less available for non-human or domestic animals. So we have literally, I call it competitive displacement. We're superior competitors, and we've just knocked them off the planet. And the irony is, this is what always kills me. If you read the economics literature, they talk about the human system, the economy decoupling from nature. We're becoming less and less dependent on the natural world. That's because economic models contain no useful information whatsoever about the physical world, the biophysical world, or even the social systems with which the economy acts in the real world. So economists start from models that literally consider the economy to be separate and independent of nature. So if you start with that perspective and you believe that as Julian Simon said, that human ingenuity is the greatest resource, and therefore we can use it to displace or replace, substitute for any product of nature. So here we have then the belief that the economy is separate from and independent of nature, and that human ingenuity in any case could replace any product of nature. That gives you a formula for the infinite expansion of humankind with the aid of our technology. And that's, of course, the platform upon the whole of our global economic system now rests. So it expands oblivious to the consequences everywhere else. And by the way, it doesn't matter anyway, since who needs all those animals? We can replace whatever functions they supply. So that's it. We operate out of a social construct which is completely divorced from biophysical reality. What could possibly go wrong? We see this massive displacement of other life, and that's what's happening. I call this overshoot. We're in a situation of overshoot on Earth, where human beings, the expansion of the human enterprise, is consuming even renewable resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate. And we're dumping wastes much faster than natural assimilation capacity and recycling capacities can handle it. We are literally consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. There are too many people consuming too much and polluting too much on a finite planet. And in fact, because we're depleting the natural capital upon which we must exist, the Earth is actually shrinking even as we get bigger. And it just goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's a fixed amount of photosynthetic energy moving through the system. The more we take, the less is available for everyone else, so they all fall off the planet. Extinction rates are now 100 to 1,000 times higher than they were in pre-industrial periods. Basically, we're hollowing out the planet. We've become, by virtue of our social constructs, the economic system and the ideologies behind it, neoliberal economics, capitalism, we've become and made of ourselves a parasite on the planet, literally sucking it dry.
Quite the overview. Thank you, Bill. Now let's bring our second guest into the conversation. Dr. Rosa Vasquez Espinoza is a Peruvian chemical biologist and National Geographic explorer. Rosa is an advocate for biodiversity, sustainability, and diversity in science and technology. Her research is focused on decoding the planet's diversity for groundbreaking medicines. Rosa, what are the major issues when it comes to humanity's relation to biodiversity?
One of the main concerns I would highlight is the fact that nature lacks legal protection. And so around the world, as a society, humans, we can count on legal protection to defend our own rights when needed at different points, under stress, and etc. However, in most places of the world, nature, and by nature I mean all forms of nature and biodiversity, trees, plants, rivers, animals, flora, etc., they lack that type of legal framework to protect them. And that is something that is trying to be solved by this movement known as the rights of nature, that aim at providing a legal protection to nature so that there are more avenues so that we can fight against things that are negatively impacting biodiversity, like illegal deforestation, illegal cattling, fires that are not expected or that are initiated by men, and all these type of other activities that are reducing the amount of biodiversity that we have around the world. So I would say that that is a main hurdle, and one of the main barriers to overcome there is how do you even begin to create a legal framework for nature? There's a few countries around the world that have successfully started to implement this for different sections of their highest biodiversity areas, like a few rivers in Colombia and a few other spaces. And the idea with that is that if someone was to contaminate those rivers, the river and anything or anyone that has an impact or gets impacted by the river, including indigenous communities that may be living nearby, etc., have more legal avenues so that they can defend the rights for the river to live there and perhaps deliver clean water for the communities, deliver clean water for the plants. And an important aspect here to note is that in order to have more success in implementing these type of strategies around the world, we need to speak the language that governments speak, because those are the bodies that are going to be accepting and implementing this type of decrees, this type of norms or laws. And in order to do that, I think it is important for scientists like me, as well as conservationists, people in the law, to come together and try to find a way to give some sort of an economical value as well as cultural value to these different aspects of biodiversity. So then that way, the implementation of these legal ways is a bit more straightforward.
A topic that's near and dear to Rosa's heart are the tiniest forms of life, microorganisms. Rosa, would you tell us about your work with microbes and how do they enter the biodiversity conversation?
We study microbes that live in soil, in sediment, as well as in rivers. And then in the next few projects that I have moving forward, we will be looking at microbes that live in plants as well as within animals like bees. So microbes are really found everywhere in the world. And something that these legal pathways are not considering this yet, but I think that will be the future after the first steps are implemented, is that microbes make the basis for all the biodiversity that we see on the planet. Without microbes, we would not have rivers, we would not have soils, we would not have healthy soils, we would not have trees, healthy animals, etc. So for us to discuss how do we protect biodiversity on the long run, what do we need to be better at doing so, especially with climate change and all these other events that are happening around the world, we need to start bringing more of this micro world into consideration. If we know what are the microbes that a healthy ecosystem needs to stay healthy, then we can actually work with other scientists and industry to create microbe-inspired solutions so that we can promote that healthy state and maintain it despite of increased temperatures on Earth, despite of contamination. So it'll be exciting to see where this micro world will go. And I think part of the work as scientists there is for us to highlight it more beyond just in academia. So to take the science that we do and not just limit it to a small audience, but how do we make people, industries, governments, the general public care and realize the impact that microbes from that tiny micro level have on everything else, and why do we need it to talk about biodiversity and protect it.
Our next guest talks the talk to educate on biodiversity and walks the walk to protect biodiversity through projects in the field. At the age of 18, while still a student, Dr. Francisco Dallmeier became curator of mammals at the La Salle Museum of Natural History in Caracas, Venezuela. 2 years later, he became the museum's director, and today he leads the Center for Conservation and Sustainability at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Washington, D.C. Francisco, why do you consider biodiversity to be a double emergency?
Well, we have the climate change, something that is happening gradually at fast speed because human cause, and also the biodiversity crisis. So the combination of both of them is putting us into a big challenging situation that we had never had anything like that in the history of humanity. Compound with that, we have our human relationship with nature. Biodiversity is under siege. People are using nature in unsustainable ways in many different fronts. And as society, we are not united in what we want to do, how we want to resolve this. And politics and other things get in the way and make nature like a secondary things, creating a number of polarities that put us in risk to really be able to address the problem. And to be united, especially to be united, and goes to the political level, most of the time is with no scientific data or information. So climate and biodiversity are not only environmental issues, it's absolutely linked to economics, to everything we do with development, with security, with social stability, of course, the moral issues and the ethical issues. The alarming trends is that global biodiversity is really going downhill very, very quickly. And the genetic capacity to rebound are decreasing. So we have an interconnection between the climate issue and the nature crisis. So it's all connected, and we are part of that connection. It's like a triangle of connections to maintain that role of biodiversity that provides our health, the productivity, and the stability, especially for many natural systems in which all life, not just humans, but also lives depends on. So the ecological humanity footprint exceeds the Earth's biocapacity. So it's like if we are living in two illusional places, one place where resources are indefinitely forever, and we can use those resources in many different ways, and it's somebody else's problems later on, how they are going to deal with that. So our ecological footprint is amazing. For the grasslands, for the forests, we are harvesting, logging, deforestation, changing forests in a way that I've never seen before. We are fishing the grounds to not only the fresh water, but also in the ocean to a point that is capacity to sustain biodiversity is being reduced. Our cropland footprint is immense. We are planting every possible place that can be planted and disregard the biodiversity, the conservation, the forestry, and of course the emission of the carbon. Carbon emissions are really high. We are keep pumping those into the air, and that's big chunk of the crisis. I work in the tropical rainforest a lot in the Amazon, and every year we basically have 10 million hectares of forests around the world have been eradicated. And that's about the size of Portugal. We can do that only so long, before we don't have a lot of these resources. And once you do that, the temperature will increase because the forest, through the evapotranspiration, creates a cooling effect. So if you have that, you have 7 to 8 degrees of temperature that will increase Celsius. That's huge. That's really significant. So with that temperature increase, there is projected that in some areas will be around 15% decrease in rainfall. So that means more droughts. More droughts, a lot of organic material to burn, and more fires that will create this cycle and more CO2 going into the atmosphere. So that's kind of the issues that I go to sleep every night, see how can we do this? How we can reconcile this aggressive destruction of the environment, and how can we get humanity to be united to address this? We have the technology, we have the good mind, we have the science to do this, but we have to do more than that.
Ian Pfingsten is a botanist by training who works at the United States Geological Survey. The U.S. Geological Survey is best known for mapping territories and attending to biological, geographical, and geological services. Ian works in the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Program. He's based in Gainesville, Florida.
One of the top contenders for the loss of biodiversity is due to habitat loss. Premier habitat for certain species, certain taxa in our ecosystems, if they are losing their habitat, obviously they're not able to thrive, something that they need for adequate reproduction of the population. Another thing is you have things like climate change that are affecting that loss of the habitat as well, or shifting the habitat into smaller sections of available space. And then you also have invasive species. That's one area that I work with intimately, where you have novel introductions of taxa that are introduced into a system that wouldn't normally be in that system were it not for human mediation, bringing that species into a new system, allowing that species to then thrive based off of its loss of some kind of limit that was placed on that species by its natural predators or natural biota, natural diseases and things like that. The species now becomes what's termed as invasive if it causes detrimental impacts to an ecosystem or our economy. Pollution as well is another form of ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss.
Now let's move to our second question. We want to know how our guests and their organizations are approaching biodiversity issues. But first, Bill, you mentioned renewable energy, and you've written extensively about renewables. When it comes to the dilemmas posed by biodiversity loss, is renewable energy a valid solution?
Well, I've got a very controversial paper out with a colleague on the whole idea of renewable energy. It simply isn't going to work. Let me give just one example. Okay, there's a huge debate going on out there in this energy world. If you read the pro-renewable green energy crowd, the people in support of such things as the Green New Deal, you would be convinced that the world is about to be completely overtaken by wind and solar power particularly, but electricity in general. So fossil fuel is on the way out. Okay, that's what we're led to believe. And in fact, 94% of all investment in energy, renewable energy, is now going into wind and solar. But here's the reality. In 2021, that's the most recent data, wind and solar provided fewer than 5% of all of the energy used on planet Earth. So if you think of a year as being 365 days, that's about 18 days. Wind and solar provided enough energy to run the planet for a tiny fraction of the year. Fossil fuel gave us, I forget, 220 or 40 days or something like that.
Bill, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP, focuses a lot of energy on reducing fossil fuels and expanding renewable energy in order to contain global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. Is this a realistic scenario?
To do that, we need to reduce fossil fuel use or emissions by 45% by 2030. The arithmetic is actually quite simple. To do that, to reduce our fossil fuel emissions by 2030, most people assume that this will be done by replacing energy by renewable wind and solar electricity. But to do that would require that we build 1.2 times the entire global stock of wind and solar installations, which is accumulated over the last 30 years, every year for the next 7 years. So we have to replicate everything we've already done, and we have to do it every year for 7 years. And that assumes there will be no growth in the demand for energy, no growth in human population. Completely absurd, because right now energy is growing at 2 or 3% per year. In fact, the rate of growth of energy, demand for energy, exceeds the rate at which new energy is being brought on stream by wind and solar. It simply can't catch up as long as we're in this growth kind of domain. Now, things may change over the next little while, but we also have to keep in mind that wind and solar technologies require fossil fuel for the mining, refining, manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and delivery. So even if we were to move as strongly as possible, governments could push us into wind and solar, it's going to mean great increases in fossil fuel emissions. A significant amount of fossil fuel will be involved in that process. Moreover, it's not really renewable. You're talking about wind towers that last at most 15 years in real use. Solar panels may be 30 years if you're really lucky. So they have to be replaced. And we don't know yet whether they can be replaced using themselves or will it have to be fossil fuel. And by the way, it has to do all of this with a minimum of environmental damage. And the only energy source so far that's able to produce itself and all the other energy provided by society is fossil fuel. So we don't manufacture alternative energy with, electricity made from alternative energy. Wind towers are not producing the electricity needed to produce the next generation of wind towers. That's mostly coming from fossil fuel. So it's a much bigger problem than people think. And it's not going to be solved in the short term, if ever.
Ian, how is the U.S. Geological Survey taking on some of the issues related to biodiversity?
One of the regions that I work with the Geological Survey is in the invasive species realm. And we work more directly on assessing the risk involved with species movement into these new systems where they weren't previously found and now presently are found. There's lots of different impacts that we monitor and take on our assessment of the risk of invasiveness of certain species. There's realms a little outside of what I do within the U.S. Geological Survey that look at water science, so like the health of the water quality throughout the country. And then they also monitor the flood conditions as well for the stream networks that we have. And a lot of it goes into the map services that we provide for the nation. But one of the areas that I've tried to be more involved with, at least, is getting that information out to the public that normally wouldn't have that information. It feels like there's sort of a disconnect between the federal sector or the type of work that we do in generating these assessments of risk and getting that information to the general public so they have knowledge that, yes, there are certain taxa or certain what we deem as harmful and impactful species in your community, and what you can do as a response to them and how that may affect you, and give them some kind of incentive and engagement in their own affairs, not make it so top-down appointed decisions, and bring more involvement with stakeholders at various levels of the community.
Francisco, how does the Smithsonian Center for Conservation and Sustainability address human impact on biodiversity?
Well, in the scale of all these global issues, we are a tiny center. We are a tiny group trying to do some important changes. So we aim to some kind of nature positive impact. We have over 25 years working with the development sector to integrate conservation needs with development priorities to sustain biodiversity. What does that mean? That means that there are hundreds of projects around the world in which you are building roads. That roads is kind of the main way to transform landscapes all over. We are building dams, we are building pipelines, we are building ports. All of that is creating impacts. There is a whole movement in how to work with the industry in a way that you can minimize those impacts. So our focus is in 4 areas. One is what we call sustainable infrastructure. That is how to design, construct, and operate infrastructure that will be friendly to biodiversity, to nature, that we maintain biodiversity and ecosystem services. In Peru, we have a project working in the Andes. We are basically a pipeline that goes through the coastal area of Peru to the Amazon. And through this pipeline, it crosses 14 ecological landscapes. We work with the company to design what areas to avoid, what areas to minimize, what areas to restore, and what is the residual impact of the project. Calculating the residual impact of the project, we can go into conservation actions in a way that at the end of the day, the project will be neutral in terms of the footprint to the environment or nature positive in a way that is adding value to conservation because of the project. We're also doing the same for putting some pilot projects for marine infrastructures. We have hundreds of ports. People live in the coastal marine areas. We have ports, we have jetties along the coastal areas that are being built, and they've been there for many, many years. And in some cases, these infrastructure are considered like a great, dirty place. Many of them are, but a few of them, or many of them, are also extremely important for biodiversity because you are creating refuges for animals and plants, places for species to colonize. So we also created this prototype also in the southern Peru for the first LNG in South America, liquefied natural gas terminal, and a whole port and a whole infrastructure, marine infrastructure was created there that now protects more biodiversity than the surrounding areas. So the area has become a focus of biodiversity conservation, well managed in a way that can be replicated in many other places. So we can use human infrastructure that is needed for society to be able to achieve this kind of conservation, this kind of sustainability. Second component is we are focusing in conservation corridors. We are working in one of the most biologically rich conservation corridor in the world that is called Vilcabamba and Boró. It's between Peru and Bolivia and also bordering Brazil. And you have the richest place on earth. And you have all different kind of uses, including some illegal mining that is creating a major issue in terms of the land use transformation. But we are developing a scenario planning. What are these scenarios that we need to do in terms of change? In 30 years, how do we position this place to still maintain its richness of biodiversity, to still maintain the sustainability of the place for the future generation and the indigenous communities, and also to connect with people, with nature.
One of Francisco's projects at the center is unfolding in the Gran Chaco, a dry forest that spans Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. The forest is home to thousands of plant species and hundreds of animal species. Francisco, tell us what's going on in the Chaco.
Tremendous pressure for transformation to cattle ranching, to agriculture, to deforestation, all kind of uses in a way that could be transformed. And we have teamed up with the financial institutions to develop a tool, a web-based platform called Assist Chaco, in which the user and the lender can actually go to the particular plot, see the conditions of that particular plot in terms of the biodiversity, ecosystem service, protection, water, wetlands, or whatever, and be able to get information to make the best possible decision about the use of that land. So this is very critical because right now it's, people just go to the land, do whatever, or try to do whatever they think is best. But for the first time, they are going to have a tool that will give them the biological information, the nature information to be able to make better decisions.
Ian and Francisco and their organizations are working to collaborate and empower communities to benefit ecosystems, or at least offset negative impacts. William Rees and his students have developed a tool in the same vein, ecological footprint analysis.
It's actually a measure of the physical area of ecosystems required by any specified population to produce all the goods and services that that population consumes and to assimilate and recycle it, at least its carbon waste. So the human ecological footprint, in fact, it was even now it's part of the Oxford English Language Dictionary, it has its own term. But what the eco footprint has shown, and you can look all of this up on globalfootprintnetwork.org. The Global Footprint Network is run by one of my former PhD students, a brilliant young man called Matthijs Wackernagel. At any rate, what we're showing is that human beings now use the equivalent of about 1.75 planet Earth. Now, people say, how can that be? There's only one planet Earth. It can be because we're drawing down. Remember I said before, we're liquidating our natural capital? So if you had a bank account with $1 million at 5% per year, you'd earn $50,000 a year in interest. And if you lived on $50,000 a year, you could do that in perpetuity. So the capital is the $1 million. Your annual interest is $50,000. And we call that natural income. So if you lived on the natural income of ecosystems, you could do it in perpetuity because you're not destroying the capital base. But human beings are using our natural ecosystems, the productivity thereof, as if they were 75% more productive than they are. So instead of just catching this year's increment of fish, we take out this year's plus some. Instead of using soil at the same rate at which it's being reconstructed, we're depleting the soil. Instead, and on, you get the point, with the tropical deforestation and all of that. So it's quite possible to use a planet 75% more than it's capable of producing, but you can only do it until you run out of capital. A race car can continue to accelerate right up to the last minute it runs out of fuel. And that's what humans are doing. We are accelerating, growing at the rate of 85 to 90 million new bodies every year, growing the economy at an even greater rate in terms of overall consumption, or at least an equivalent rate. That means we're depleting the tank, Earth's fuel tank, and we're not even noticing. And one of the reasons we don't notice, by the way, is globalization. Because if a country like the UK or the Netherlands or Japan completely uses up its annual productivity, it can just import from somewhere else. So what globalization does through trade is enable pockets of rich consumers to draw down the capital assets of other countries. And so that's exactly what we're doing. Trade just moves productive capacity around so that we all will hit the global carrying capacity ceiling at the same time. The point I'm getting at is that eco-footprint analysis has become, I think, the best known indicator of fundamental human unsustainability. And economists hate it because they're operating from this model that says, well, we can decouple and basically we're not independent of nature. We can show Every ecosystem consists of producers, consumers, and decomposers. The producers are the green plants. The consumers basically are animals, and the decomposers are fungi and bacteria. So the green plants capture the solar energy, turn it into biomass, which is then consumed by animals and plants and bacteria. And the bacteria return the nutrients back to the soil, carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and the whole thing just keeps recycling. Okay? So ecosystems are perfect in the sense that the same material is constantly being reused and recycled. You contain many, many molecules and atoms that once roamed the Great Plains of Asia in dinosaurs, simply because the same stuff is circulating through the ecosphere. So humans are in the group called consumer organisms. And we can measure the amount of biomass that humans appropriate from ecosystems. And to make a long story short, people are now the single largest consumer organism in every single major ecosystem type on planet Earth. We're both the largest predators or meat eaters. We're also the largest herbivores. No one else comes close. No other species comes close. We make Tyrannosaurus rex look like pikers when it comes to being predators. And our species is operating out of a mental construct which doesn't even consider us to be part of nature. That's how completely befuddled we are. People socially construct realities, economics, religion, political ideologies. These are all made up concepts of the human mind, which may or may not overlap with any significant part of biophysical reality that they purport to represent. So we operate from an economic system that assumes nature is unimportant. And in the reality, we are the single most important consumer species in every ecosystem. We are not decoupling. We're becoming more embedded as we grow. As people get richer, their consumption of meat goes up, and therefore their imprint on the planet, their eco-footprint, automatically rises. So we're living in a world that has nothing to do with the biophysical reality that we actually physically occupy and are destroying in the process of that occupation. I mentioned that globalization accelerates this process. Think of urbanization. I was terrifically fortunate in having much of my youth living on my grandparents' farm in southern Ontario. That taught me how close we are to the earth. I can remember sitting in my grandma's country porch and observing my plate, but I'd had a hand in growing everything on that plate, from chicken to beef and 3 or 4 new vegetables and so on and so forth. We are literally what we eat, and it comes from the land. That's a terrific insight for an 8-year-old child. No kid today living in New York or Toronto has any sense whatsoever of his connectivity to the land. So urbanization has not only removed people physically from the ecosystems that support them, but it's created an enormous psychological disconnect so that we have no psychological sense of being in nature, being part of the wildlife and the biodiversity that we're talking about here. And I'm not romanticizing the natural world. 100 years ago, we'd have fleas and lice, and we might be prey to some predator. But so nature's a weird and wild place. But the fact is, we're dependent on it, whether we like it or not, and we're destroying it as fast as we can. And it looks like we're going to continue to do so as long as we have the energy to do so.
Wow, you've highlighted so many fascinating elements, Bill. Thank you. Let's wrap up question 2 with you, Rosa. Can you tell us how you and your colleagues are working on the ground in the Amazon?
So right now I have 2 main projects. One is focused on Amazonian stingless bees. As the name suggests, those bees do not sting, and they make medicinal honey that the indigenous communities have been using for thousands and thousands of years. Most of the people in the world don't know that we have stingless bees on the planet. Most of them live around the tropics in different jungles, not just in the Peruvian jungle. We are looking at what kind of medicinal molecules are found or not found in the honey, what kind of microbes live within these bees. Can we understand more about how to keep these bees healthy? Because the concept of bees dying around the world does not stop. We see more of that, and we need to find more creative solutions for reforestation. And one that hasn't been fully addressed for reforestation and protection of the Amazonian biodiversity is native bees. And I think that is a very viable tool. And in that aspect, we are also working closely with the communities because indigenous families are the ones that do the native local beekeeping. And so part of our work there has been to identify sustainable ways for this beekeeping. The traditional ways was to cut down the tree where the bee panel is, and then you extract the honey. Now we are showing them how to grow those bees without having to cut down trees. So that's a way already of protecting biodiversity through using that type of science in a practical way. But moving forward, we want to use this type of science to try to promote resolutions and decrees from the legal conservation aspect that would protect the biodiversity in that space, the biodiversity of the bees. So they have a right to survive, not only by the fact that they are necessary pollinators in our planet, like one of two foods that we could not get without bees. And so that's on one aspect, but also from the aspect that the communities have a right for the bees to be able to exist. Without them, they would be losing a very important source of economy in their local area because they sell the honey, they sell the pollen, they use it for tourists. And then on the other side, I have a second project that is looking at the microbes that live in this extreme boiling river that is located in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon. And it's a very, quote unquote, extreme space because the river, as the name implies, it is indeed boiling, yet there's luscious vegetation and animals living around it without any problems. So from our scientific curiosity, we were really interested in understanding, well, nothing can survive in that river except microbes. What allows them to survive? And the idea is for us to create this first microbial map that shows a different face of the jungle biodiversity, that shows the Amazonian jungle at a level different than just looking at the trees, the jaguars, the animals, etc. But noticing, do we have new bacterial species? Are they helping in maintaining the health of the river? Are they helping in maintaining the health of the soils around it? Could we get any tools from these microbes that have evolved to develop these genetics that allow them to survive where nothing else can, to protect, for example, the trees and plants in the Amazon that are suffering from increased temperatures and less water all around in the world? So that is on one side. I think it's how do we show the importance, relevance culturally, biologically, economically, in all of these ways of microbes in the Amazonia as an example that this could in reality be taken anywhere else. So I would say from both of our works, in different ways, we are trying to address all of these topics about biodiversity.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Rosa. Let's move on to our third question. Francisco, what stands in the way of addressing biodiversity fundamentally? And does capitalism help or hinder solutions?
Capitalism and economic development and free market has raised a lot of people out of poverty for many years. So the big responsibility here is in the world leaders that have basically this challenge. We need a disruptive approach that will drive nature to a point in which we can be more sustainable, hold it and move it forward. In terms of the agriculture and the beef productions have to be managed different, overfishing, forestry, infrastructure and extractive uses. We need to drive innovation and accelerate towards sustainable production and consumption behaviors. We need to work in a way that we can provide that economics formula that will work, provide social stability that you can see that's changing and dramatically all around us and everywhere. Also generate the human well-being and it's also a matter of justice because we are in all of this together in this global planet. So we need a global plan. We need the complementary goals of going for this 2030 net positive, nature positive, but also to be net zero emission by 2050. The combination of those two, this is our roadmap. This is our GPS. This is our ways to get to that.
Yeah, but is that happening right now?
Well, we need to do another step, get that same force to be really aggressive in terms of green infrastructure, green issues, green development, reducing carbon, maintaining ecosystem, and make money on that. is that you have to develop an economic incentive, a way for people to live. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need the technology, we need the case studies, we need the know-how, we need the capitalism and the development sector to really get into there with innovation. And it's coming. I see it in many different fronts how people are trying to neutralize investment. I see some of the big banks getting into carbon neutral and how they can do carbon bonuses or reforestation programs. I see banks buying logging companies or forestry companies to figure it out how to work this market. So it's coming. It's just that it has to come in a faster speed, more united, more fronts working together.
But being united and acting quickly is easier said than done. Bill, let me put this question to you. How quickly can we move when a major part of the equation is untouched? Are capitalism and survival compatible?
Well, capitalism is dedicated to the proposition of accumulation. It can't survive in the absence of the growth ethic. So I think of capitalism as the kind of intellectual framing, but neoliberal economics has become the handmaiden of the capitalist machine. So you can't really separate the neoliberal economic paradigm. This is the one we've been talking about. Humans are separate from nature. Human ingenuity is our greatest resource. And therefore, growth can be infinite and propelled constantly by new forms of technological engagement. And there's a huge amount of evidence to support that. For 200 years, we've seen the steady improvement in economic and technological efficiency and continuous growth. And as some resources ran out, we did find substitutes. But to say this can continue forever on a finite planet is the same as my saying I am immortal. By the way, a friend of mine just sent this to me. He said, look, Bill, I'm immortal. I've lived 21,000 days. There's not a single day in which evidence refutes my sense of immortality. You see what I'm getting at? He's going to die the next day. Capitalism may die the next day, but heretofore it's had lots of reinforcement of its fundamental beliefs. I'm a population ecologist, that human beings are no different from any other species in our basic population biology. Every species we know of is capable of exponential population growth, but they don't, because within the natural systems, they're held back by negative feedback, resource scarcity, predation, weather, whatever it might be. There's all sorts of things that keep species in line. Humans were no different up until the middle part of the 19th century. For the most part, that 250,000 years of modern human history, growth was not an issue. There was none to speak of, or it was so slow, it was immeasurable. Only 10 generations of people in the last 200 years, say, have seen significant growth in their lifetimes and sufficient change in technological prowess to even notice. So if you go back 300 years, you could live to be 90, but the world was pretty much the same at the day of your death as it was on the day of your birth. Today, look, every single major technological thing in my environment, aircraft, jet engines, have happened in my lifetime. So there's been this enormous increase in social evolution or cultural evolution that has vastly outstripped our biological evolution. So humans have been suppressed for most of our history until fossil fuel. Fossil fuel, which particularly in the 19th century, when we started using oil in great quantities, provided the means by which humans could relieve themselves of all the negative feedback holding us in check. So for the first time, there were no food shortages to speak of for the majority of people. We ballooned. Modern medicine came into the fore and population health improved. So two things happened. Population health improved, particularly a reduction in death rates because of the lack of negative feedback. And with the provision of fossil fuel, we could accumulate all the other resources, food, minerals, whatever, to grow the human enterprise. So like any other species temporarily exposed to an environment of unlimited resources, we responded with exponential growth. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So many species in nature go through cyclical boom busts. When the environment is good and there's lots of food, the population booms, and then they reach the point where they deplete the resources or predators are attracted to their increased numbers and they get slammed back. negative feedback kicks in and the population crashes. So it's called a boom-bust cycle. In my opinion, and that's all it is, we are very near the peak of a one-off population boom-bust cycle. Because with the collapse of the fossil fuel sector in the next few decades and the failure to develop a replacement, we will not be able to provision even the present population, let alone 10 billion people. I don't care what energy supply you get, you won't be able to do it because we've already blown so much. There's only 50 years worth of soil left at current rates of erosion. Who cares? Well, economists say it doesn't matter because we can substitute fertilizer. But fertilizer is based on fossil fuel. Pesticides, fossil fuel. Irrigation, diesel generation. So we've got an enormous problem facing us just in terms of the energy issue. Bottom line is that human beings, for the first time in their entire evolutionary history, finally had the pressures of negative feedback removed. We responded accordingly by exploding exponentially through exponential growth, but we're reaching the top of I think we're reaching the pinnacle of the human game, and then it's going to crash because we don't have the resource base. In other words, negative feedback will kick in once again. And by the way, it is. There are more people, for the first time in 2 or 3 decades, there are more people now short of food and shelter than ever before. The numbers are rising again. We're seeing wars over resources in places like, Ukraine, obviously. And by the way, that war is showing us how delicate the whole global system is by threatening supply lines. Everybody's concerned about fertilizer, much of which is manufactured in Russia, and so on and so forth. So it's caused a crisis, even though it's one tiny little country in one small part of the world. It's a friggin' global crisis because it begins to give us some insights into what lies ahead should the great system that we have built around us tumble. And should it tumble, that's great for nature, not so great. Well, maybe not, because we'll take a lot of other good stuff with us.
And what impedes solutions?
First of all, nobody's paying the remotest attention to what you and I are talking about. Not in the mainstream, not in the government circles. I can't get anybody in our own House of Commons to talk seriously about these issues, particularly since we've just come through COVID, and now the biggest concern is inflation, an economic problem. We've got more and more people who can't afford to eat. Homelessness is becoming a major issue. Suddenly we're coming to grips with some of the realities that lie behind this enormous expansion that we've come through. So the focus is returned to the safety of humans in the kind of economic system that we've built. Another problem, we evolved. So humans evolved under very simple circumstances. You might meet a dozen or two, maybe 100 other people in your entire life. You would live in the same region in what we call a home range, and you'd probably die a few kilometers from your place of birth. So there was no significant major challenges to the development of the human central nervous system. It was perfectly all right to think in very simplistic, very reductionist terms, simple cause-effect relationships. And things we didn't understand, we simply mythologized. So the idea of the sun god or the moon god or the storm gods or whatever. We lived in simple environments, and we could not and didn't need to understand complexity. Today, we have created a world of overlapping complex systems. So it's a complex of complexes. And any one of the systems, the economy, the climate system, the ecosystem, the internet, the communication system, transportation, no one person can wrap his mind around any one of the subsystems, let alone the integrated whole. Moreover, whereas 10,000 years ago, nothing happened in the course of your life, today everything happens in the course of a person's lifetime. 1/2 of all the fossil fuel ever consumed on planet Earth has been consumed in the last 40 years. 90% in the course of my lifetime. So the pace of change is vastly outstripped our capacity to really comprehend the implications of that. If we are in overshoot now, with every doubling of any entity, think about it, This is exponential growth. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. If you look at any one of those numbers, 128, if you summed all the previous doublings, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, the sum at the end of the last doubling is greater than the sum of all the previous doublings combined. Okay, so 128 is a bigger number than 64 plus 32 plus 16 and so on down there. So here we are in a state of overshoot right now by 75%, we think. And we expect the economy to double in the next 35, 40 years. That means more energy will be consumed in the next 35 or 40 years than has been consumed to date since at least the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it can't happen on a finite planet already stressed to the limits that we're at today. More minerals will be consumed in the next 30 years than have ever been consumed in the history of humankind. And look at the damage it's caused to the planet. We're suffering from plastic pollution, water pollution, air pollution, ocean acidification, massive everything. And we want to double all of that to sustain the human enterprise? And by the way, kiss biodiversity goodbye if that's the kind of world that we're going to promote. So what's impeding the kind of work I do? The whole mental attitude, the whole cultural narrative, the socioeconomic geopolitical paradigm, which is industrial capitalism currently having adopted as its handmaiden neoliberal economics. And by the way, communism is no different. It is the same material grounding and ambitions. It's just vastly less efficient at getting the job done.
Let's return to the Amazon, Rosa. What are some of the obstacles that you face?
So on the aspect of the bee project, one of the biggest challenges that we have found, although I think using the arts has been really impactful and powerful to help us start to overcome that challenge, is the fact that most people don't know that there are stingless bees in the world. I do think it's derived from capitalism. The reason why most of us only know about the honeybee, the one that has a sting, Apis mellifera, that are European or African, and that derives from the fact that from a long time ago, any person involved in agriculture, they know that they need to keep bees around so that they can increase the production of their crops. And by having those specific kind of bees, the honeybee, they can produce a lot of honey, about 40 kilos per panel of honey, and sell that. So it's a double revenue. However, with stingless bees, they've been left aside mostly because they don't produce that much honey. And I'm not saying that that's the only reason why people have not really focused at a massive scale on native bees, but I think it's definitely a strong one. Because if one makes the argument, well, native bees may not be that good at pollinating the agricultural crops, then that's actually not true. And there's not been that many studies, but there are starting to be studies out there, including some of the ones we're conducting with my colleagues in Peru, that show that native bees could be even better pollinators than these foreign European or African bees for native plants, native crops. So I think that push from capitalism is something we may also encounter when trying to propose these decrees to promote native beekeeping in the Amazon instead of just bringing the foreign bees, which actually displace the native bees from the original environments. So part of our work is how do we use this basic science, genetics, chemistry, but in a way that could actually be used in a positive way by native communities so that they can improve their own cycle, because without an economic incentive, it's really hard for people to really try to consistently, sustainably protect the jungle. At the end of the day, everybody needs to put food on the table. And if there's other ways to do that that may not be sustainable with the jungle, they will.
Does the hand of capitalism appear in your work with microbes?
So on the human health side, I think there's a lot of awareness for the negative microbes, the ones that are causing disease. And I think in a parallel way, we need the same emphasis in areas that are some of the hotspot biodiversity areas in the world, so that we can also be better at preventing the disasters that cause there, but also finding solutions to remediate what we've already destroyed. Microbes have been found that can degrade oil. in some instances around the world, like in Mexico, they have already been used to help clean up oil spills in a very green way without using another toxic to help clean up the toxins and to try to do it in a way that we could have a quick response. I think it's still to some extent costly because not many of the technologies have been focused on developing these solutions, but that is a solution. Microbes for bioremediation, to clean oil, perhaps to degrade plastic. There's already been microbes that have been found that can degrade plastics. Another solution, could we use microbes to help plants cope with increased temperatures? There are some plants that are going extinct because they cannot sustain the increased temperatures and lower humidities that we're having around the world. They cannot sustain these drought conditions. However, there are studies that show that some microbes have the capacity to provide this, like what we know as a thermal protection. So they interact with the plant or a coral reef and help it survive in increased temperatures. And so that's another solution. And just like the ones I described, there's many more that all refer to ultimately biodiversity that could be inspired by microbes.
So a lot of energy is invested in remediating problems caused by humanity.
To some extent, yeah. Definitely, I think the more efforts have been focused on bioremediation, but not to the extent that we needed to actually consistently clean up those messes. And I think that's why it is important to continue highlighting that, because we need it, and we need it like yesterday. But it's also equally important to highlight the kind of work that we are trying to do, which is, yes, show that potential, but then show how not only for bioremediation and clean up things that we already created, but how do we make things better moving forward for spaces that may not necessarily have oil spills or, massive amounts of deforestation, but that are suffering from the impacts of climate change without perhaps necessarily added human activity to it directly. When we talk about microbes and I tell people, this is where you can find them, this is how you can look for them, this is what it means, all of a sudden what we knew about biodiversity, in my opinion, gets expanded almost by 50%. Because then you see all of this new life that is present. And then I think, in my opinion, or at least in my experience, I've seen that adds a whole sense of appreciation for biodiversity out there, but also of interconnectedness. All of a sudden, if we understand or if we know that some microbes that are found in a river in the middle of the rainforest may have some sort of connection with microbes that you can find in your local river in the north of the United States, I think it also creates this sense that the world is interconnected, and it helps create this sense of, I should care, I should help, volunteer, donate, or vote in an appropriate way to help protect these other spaces that are suffering even more from the impacts of climate change so that we can protect that biodiversity.
And Ian, what stands in the way of solutions when it comes to your work at the U.S. Geological Survey?
I think there is a role that maybe doesn't get the prominence in the scientific community regarding the role of capitalism or markets. We do see that there are problems inherent to a market-based economy and private capital and ownership of resources like land that tends to neglect ecosystem services, neglect biodiversity, neglect the health of our community and our biota, that has detrimental effects that become externalities. And those externalities are not typically accounted for in a market-based private economy if there's not some monetary value assigned to them. So, for instance, we have a lot of reservoirs. They're impounded or dammed water systems or streams that are maintained by government entities, usually the federal agency. Sometimes state agencies will own them, and sometimes power utility companies will own these reservoirs if they're generating power. And they are used for recreational purposes as well. So they have sort of this cultural and aesthetic value to them. And that value also becomes market-based, in that it brings in tourism, it brings in its own economy and its own concerns when there's loss of that value in that system due to the detriment of the environment. They're not bringing in tourism dollars. They're not bringing in state funds that normally would be assigned for basic licensing fees and things like that for fishing. We need to come up with ways to make this ecosystem function in a way that's beneficial to our economy. That's the primary focus. Secondarily, it seems like if there's benefit to the ecosystem, that's great too. But it seems like the primary driver is bringing in that income to the economy that was somehow impacted. I think it's driven by our manifestation of this market system that's artificial, right? Like we don't need to have it to function, and we don't need to have ownership of capital by these private entities to function. And I don't see continuing with the path of a market-based economy and capitalism as a whole is going to generate solutions for the long run. Maybe there'll be a lot of short-term solutions just to keep things going for a select few. And that's getting into a whole nother issue about environmental justice, where you see the communities that have the money to spend to mitigate these costs and control these are the more affluent communities, right? That can maintain the ecosystem that they want to have for their own recreation and their own economy and their community, where then you see the pollution being not as well mitigated and more concentrated in the less affluent communities, in the poverty-stricken communities. And we just see that in Jackson, Mississippi, with the floods there and the loss of potable water. I have a feeling, too, we're going to see more of this reliance on a market system and capitalism in general to come up with solutions for these larger scale, more existential problems like climate change. When you look at what is given as an option for individuals to affect their community around them, you have to look and, I guess, see like what power do people have in their community to manifest this change that needs to happen. And if it's either a reliance on somebody else to do it for you and say that, you know, we're the authority and we're going to make the right decision for you, that could lead to some potential bias where that authority may or may not know exactly what needs to be done. That tends to happen in centrally planned economies that are so narrowly focused at the top and then trying to get as much input as they can from local constituents, but without much decision making from those local constituents that may upend their authority. There's that realm. I see like one potential aspect where people are, you know, saying they're going to vote for their local constituent that's going to enact certain policies or jurisdictions and legislation that's going to affect them. And that people feel empowered by that, that's great. But I think it needs to be more involvement than just that. And part of that's part of, you know, getting the education to know what needs to be done, how they can be involved, how they can get engaged and incentivized and take ownership of these communal goods. Because that's, I mean, it's a communal resource that everybody should be involved in and care about. It definitely feels like the most empowered you can make somebody is with the knowledge that they can enact the change themselves and through their community, knowing the cascading effects. And I don't think it's beyond people's comprehension. And maybe that's naive of me to say, because I'm coming from this biased point of my educated stance, but just the general background of biology and ecology, you can always get more and more complicated, right? But the general layout of these principles that we've been talking about, I think you can understand just as well as comprehending how to read or comprehending how to solve a math equation. It's new terminology for a lot of people because it's not been emphasized. There needs to be shown that there's value in biodiversity, that there's value in having not only diversity of flora and fauna, but people and thought, that what's called bet hedging. You know, you find out that certain things may work better than others. And if you start leaving out all these different avenues of options, you run the risk of, you know, losing your sustainability through that loss of diversity. You know, it's kind of a general rule in diversity, but we see it a lot in the biological sciences as well, from, you know, the crops that we grow and their susceptibility to disease if you go through monocultures versus variety of different strains. to the diversity of an ecosystem and plants and animals and their resilience to invasion by novel species and their ability to rebound after a major disturbance, say like a hurricane or a fire. A diverse ecosystem tends to have more resiliency. But that needs to be imparted in a way to the general public that they have that incentive and that engagement to want to preserve that and appreciate it and see the connection that it has to the resources like clean water and available food and clean air and reduction in the effects of climate change that potentially will affect not only them now, but future generations. Thinking about my own issues that I'm dealing with, it feels like I'm definitely just documenting sort of the demise in a way, to put it bluntly and kind of pessimistically, because I'm watching the spread of these new introductions across the landscape and generating these distribution maps of new species introductions throughout the United States. And the points of success where populations are controlled are few and far between, where you say, okay, we actually went and mitigated the spread of this species, and we're able to now say that this area is back to we consider it our restored habitat. And again, that's sort of a loaded human-centered value that we give it. But even slimmer, or I guess sparser, is the number of times that these mitigation efforts occur naturally or without the use of the traditional means of pesticides.
In your opinion, Francisco, is deep change possible?
My work is focusing on how we can do stuff at the local scale and areas where we can do an impact and how we can influence, working with the government, with the industry, with the stakeholders, because it's everybody. So it's the industry, but it's also the local indigenous people, it's the government policies. Another big issue that we didn't talk about is corruption. Corruption is huge. Corruption is unbelievable. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It can undermine any kind of system. And we can see that in many countries, and some countries how corruption has really wiped out what they have, even though they are sitting in the largest oil reserve in the world, and a country is doesn't have enough resources to support their people. We see corruption and mismanagement as a big issue also for destroying nature and making nature unsustainable. For the U.S., what is in North America, what is coming is bad. We have the major droughts coming in Central America. Major droughts because of climate change. Those people have to eat. So people have to get the farm more productive, and there is no water. Water is getting depleted big time. So they have to come up. They're going to come up. Morally, how much longer can you block the border and say, no, we don't want anybody here? I mean, how are we going to address this issue of the droughts in Central America, Every crisis, everybody wants to come here for many crises because we are the hope. So, let's take advantage of that hope and put it together, get our heads together. We are such a creative culture of innovation. We have the luxury to study and do stuff that we want to do, versus most of the world that waking up every day to how am I going to feed my family today? Where am I going to sleep tonight? So we have that capacity to use 95% of our time to think in innovation and change and influence this direction. Most of the world don't have that. The 100% of the time is survival. And that's not a good recipe for sustainability. People feel lost. The common John Doe doesn't see the connection, how he or she can actually make a difference or contribute somehow. But I think that's why we need to unite society, some direction, give them some suggestions what to do, get active, get knowledge. How can we make this neighborhood more green? How can we reduce our energy use? In the South, we've been using instant water heaters with gas. That is just you use those immediately, and you don't need to heat water constantly and burn gas to be able to keep 50 gallons of water ready whenever you want it. In the South and in the Caribbean, you see now all these solar panels that heat the water with water heaters. It's becoming more and more common in some places. Let's collect all the leaves from the neighborhood We make a big pile, we get a mulcher, and we mulch all the stuff, and we put all this mulch in the parks or in the jars to bring it back. Let's get rid of the lawns. Let's get 95% lawn-free and bring forests back or natural species back and get rid of all these chemicals and stuff that is messing up the environment. I mean, there are ways to do that. How many more golf courses do we need? Well, just keep the golf courses, but all around that, forget about the lawn. Hundreds of thousands or whatever lawn mowers mowing and producing all this junk, putting more fertilizer to keep it green. We are disconnected. In this country, probably we don't need to worry much about where are we going to eat tomorrow because we more or less have resources to do that. But, we are disconnected. If we connect people and create competitions and create markets, I mean, all this could go in a different direction, but our leadership is not providing that. It's not a way to gain votes. It's not a way to have 4 years in the government that will give you to the next step. So we need to be more aggressive.
Bill, would you like to share a few final thoughts on what impedes us from moving closer to biodiversity solutions?
Information makes no difference if your mindset is wedded to an ideology that's in opposition. So another weakness of the human brain is that customary patterns of thought that we're teaching over and over again to our youth in the universities become literally embedded in the brain. They create neural pathways, neural circuits. And once these circuits are embedded, people tend to seek out people or experiences or new knowledge that reinforces that which they already believe, okay? And they reject, forget, or deny contrary information. If you want to find a terrific little book on this, it's called Brain and Culture by Bruce Wexler, who talks about how we frame different issues. Framing is the set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that we bring into any particular set of circumstances. And once we framed whatever it is, according to these beliefs, values, or assumptions, they again tend to create circuitry in the brain that is self-reinforcing and rejecting of alternative. George Lakoff is the name. Don't Think of an Elephant is his most famous book, and there's a revision of it. So humans are in effect mentally impeded by their own advanced brains. This habit, it's a way of habituating, was actually highly adaptive. Remember back in those 10,000 years ago and earlier that I talked about? If you learned everything your community knew very quickly so that it became embedded, so that the tribal norms, the tribal myths, and so on became part of your intellectual hardware, it gave enormous survival value because it had obviously been tested over time. And since nothing changed, it was solid. And so it gave you a sense of identity. This is who I am. These are the beliefs, values, and assumptions that make me. And I share it with this group of people. So it's group cohesion, which was very useful in dealing with non-members of your group. Every human group we've ever looked at has an in-group and out-group predisposition. So that's the basis of tribalism. That's the basis of racism, let's face it. It's a natural human tendency. So an adaptation that was very useful 10,000 and 100,000 years ago, same brain, has become maladaptive today because that kind of adaptation was for an unchanging environment where once you got it right, it was very useful to be able to embed the same way of thinking in your offspring and inculcate them into the tribe as quickly and as efficiently and effectively as possible. Today, it's not going to work because everything's changing so rapidly. What we need is rapid flexibility in response to new information.
What might promote the kind of flexibility that you're talking about?
It requires a profound understanding of the paradigmatic framework with which that narrative operates. So what are the beliefs? What are the values? What are the assumptions? What are the behaviors that spring out of this particular way of thinking that are so profoundly at odds with the way the real universe operates? Give an example. Look up the word exceptionalism. Human beings in our culture, what I call Western techno-industrial society, operate from a foundation of exceptionalism. We do not believe ourselves to be like the other animals. We do not believe ourselves to be beholden to the laws of nature. We are outside of nature. Does this matter? Yes, it does. That's where the economists have built their models too. Remember I said earlier that your basic economic models operate as if the economy were a self-replicating, self-producing, totally independent machine. Well, that's human exceptionalism expressed in that particular discipline. But it's right across our disciplines. The humanities, many of my colleagues at the universities were absolutely furious with me because I insisted that humans were an embedded part of nature, beholden to the same fundamental laws, the biophysical laws of thermodynamics and reproductive biology as every other species. They thought that was nonsense. Humans are different. We're completely... Well, I'm sorry. Don't believe it. And I think we're beginning to see that that's the problem. We've got to start then to redefine our way of thinking.
Bill, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
So if I had my magic wand, it would be profound recognition. Every child should be taught from birth that you are an integral component of the ecosystems that support you by providing the food, the water, the atmosphere. You know, people don't realize that the atmosphere is completely a creation of biodiversity. There's no oxygen in the atmosphere without green plants. There's no nitrogen in the present form in the atmosphere without green plants. Carbon dioxide is returned there by the respiration of animals and plants so that it can recycle through the system. The oceans, the chemistry of the oceans is basically controlled by the life within the oceans. And there's now a tremendous amount of work being done to suggest that the climate is largely affected by a very thin layer, a micromolecular layer of lipids and whatnot that forms over the oceans at certain times and so on. So this is bordering on the Gaia hypothesis, that the Earth as a whole is a self-regulating system that produces the conditions necessary for life. So the atmosphere, the Earth is the creation now of life on Earth, continuing to produce the conditions necessary for life on Earth. We call it autopoiesis. Autopoiesis means self-organizing, self-producing. So the Earth, the ecosphere, is a self-producing system that constantly recycles all of the essential minerals, all the matter necessary for life, using an off-planetary source of energy called solar energy. Photosynthesis is the process for life on Earth because it appropriates that energy, turns it into chemical energy, which is then used by all other life on the planet. Well, not all. There's still some chemosynthetic bacteria, but 90%, 99% probably. We are part of all of that. We cannot grow. We must maintain ourselves. Every system that is stable and livable is a constant balancing act between the positive and negative feedback forces. So when humans discovered fossil energy and were able to improve our public health standards, we enabled positive feedback. So the population boom took place. We took away the negative feedback of resource shortages, disease, predation, and so on. But we've now filled the planet. Okay? And the negative feedback will come back on us. So we either can impose it ourselves, which is, I'm getting to answer your question, knowing that you are part of a system that cannot thrive on continuous positive feedback by any of its major components, you either have to allow yourself to be controlled by negative feedback imposed by the system, or you implement your own negative feedback. Family planning, birth control, all of the kinds of things that are currently prohibited by the Catholic Church, the US government, and so on around the planet. Do you see what I'm getting at here? So it is a question of deciding what is valuable. Listen, growth has become the idol of our culture. The assumption is all other values flow from growth. Well, that's bullshit. Growth simply means getting bigger. Herman Daly, the late Herman Daly, one of my heroes, made over and over again the point that growth is simply physical accretion It means getting bigger. You can get bigger and de-develop. Development means getting better. It means qualitative improvement. So there's a hugely important distinction to be made here. You can have a system that grows but gets worse. And I would argue that, well, your country, my country are both growing, but they're getting worse in terms of income disparity, homelessness. There's a wonderful book called The Spirit Level, which measures public health indicators of all the major countries on the planet. And what the spirit level shows is that the rich countries, particularly those with large income gaps, have the lowest levels of public health. More suicides, more murders, more gun problems, and blah, 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 blah. So growth doesn't necessarily mean getting better. Development, by definition, means improvement in the quality of being. So instead of focusing on growth per se, which simply means getting bigger, we need to shift our values toward getting better, improving the opportunities for people, improving the life expectancy of people, improving public health, improving opportunities without necessarily growing. So that's an enormous shift. Bottom line, if I wave my magic wand, it requires a complete re-examination of the fundamental beliefs, values, and assumptions behind the kind of social paradigm, cultural paradigm we've created now, which values and worships growth and accretion above development and improvement. And it means learning to live not apart from, but as a part of the natural systems that sustain us. It means not clear-cutting a forest, but regenerating that forest so that it becomes the carbon sink that we need. We still need to burn that carbon, but we need to have some way of assimilating it and bringing it back into the natural system. So it's kind of almost turning on its head of all of the beliefs, values, and assumptions that have led us into this crisis, including the biodiversity crisis, because it is the growth paradigm and the devaluation of nature that is resulting in the biodiversity crisis.
Thank you for joining us for Here to There, and thanks to our guests, Francisco Dallmeier, Rosa Espinoza, Ian Pfingsten, and William Rees. We really appreciate everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus programs, including an interview with Constanza Prieto-Figelist on the rights of nature. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed this episode of Here to There, please comment, like, and add us on your favorite podcast platforms. Here to There was edited by Joshua Cash, with assistance from Darren Chorley and Jay Blanchett. Sound design and mixing is by Claudio De Benedictis. The music for Here to There is by Daniel Land. Our executive producers are Chicky Munch and Beanie Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg, Easton Kant, and Gerald Gerbel. This is Mina Joshua signing off from the gardens at Catalista Centrale. See you next time for part 2 of Here to There.